What has happened in the text is that Alcibiades has whipped the Athenian people into such a frenzy to desire Sicily that Nicias, the other commander who's advising against this expedition, realizes he simply can't even convince the Athenians that it's a bad idea. And so he attempts to argue that they simply don't have the resources for such a massive expedition. This is what Thucydides, in his own name, again, a rarity for Thucydides. He rarely inserts his own thoughts or opinions about things, and we're going to see why later in this discussion. But Thucydides says the following: Nicias said all this, thinking that he would thereby deter the Athenians by the magnitude of the task he was presenting, or if he were forced to undertake the expedition, that they would on this basis at least be sailing out with the maximum security. The Athenians, however, were not to be shaken from their passionate desire for the expedition by the prospect of these burdensome preparations. Now, the word translated there as passionate desire, that's epithumia. Plato's Socrates in the Republic is going to use that same word to describe part of the soul in his tripartition of the soul. But not even that rises to the level of Eros, because that's what's coming next. Continuing, Thucydides, in his own name, says, in fact, they, the Athenians, were all the more motivated, and the result was just the opposite of what he, Nicias, had expected. They, the Athenians, thought that he, Nicias, had given them good advice, and that now the safety of the enterprise would be fully assured. And here's the key line. Everyone, in other words, all of the Athenians alike, had fallen in love with the voyage. Now, the word there used for love is eros. The result is that all of the Athenians had an eros for the expedition to Sicily. And Thucydides then gives an amazing description of the blinding power of eros at the level of politics. He says, the older men, believing that either they would overwhelm the places they sailed against, or that so great a force could at least suffer no disaster. The younger men of military age, yearning to see the far-off sights and spectacles, full of good hope for their safe return. Now, 2 points about that particular sentence. The younger military age people, they were yearning to see these far-off sights. Now, the word that's translated there as yearning is pathos, and the far-off sights or spectacles, that's theoria. The young men of military age had a pathos for theoria. This in itself is an extremely powerful psychological insight, because what Thucydides is telling us is that the eros that swept all across the entirety of Athens manifested itself in the young military-aged men as a pathos for theoria. To have a yearning for spectacles, a pathos for theoria, that's simply a junior level kind of version of philosophy, which is to say the longing and wonder for things unknown. But continuing, Thucydides, again in his own name, says, and the mass of common soldiery, seeing an opportunity to earn some money in the short term and to acquire a power that would be an endless source of earnings in the future. And in the face of this extreme passion on the part of the majority, anyone who felt otherwise was afraid of seeming disloyal if he voted against and therefore held his peace. And the Greek that gets translated as extreme passion right there, that's pleonon, epithumia. And the importance of that word pleonon is that pleonexia is always understood to be inherent in the soul of man, whether it's in Plato, whether it's in Thucydides, whether it's in Aristotle, that is always the greatest danger. What that means, pleonexia, pleonon here as an adjective, is that it is always grasping for more. Nothing satisfies it, always grasping ever more. And it's that last sentence right there. You really have it. The power of fashion when it concerns political eros. It silences all opponents. And let me emphasize, it's the power of political eros to silence anyone else dissenting that makes it, in other words, political eros, so incredibly powerful. As I'll go into great detail in a later discussion, every single thing about the world in which we live today, in other words, the modern world, was deliberately set into motion by the early modern founders through exploiting political eros in the form of vanity and fashion. And precisely that is going to be what undergirds their anti-biblicism, by which I simply mean the ways in which they manipulated biblical scripture to justify their political project. But because of all of this being at stake, let me emphasize here precisely what comes tumbling out of that paragraph by Thucydides in his name about political eros. It was the last sentence of that paragraph concerning the extreme passion of the majority to silence anybody else from dissenting, where we see the fullest import of political eros for Thucydides versus the role of eros in Homer. And for instance, whereas in Homer we can see the tragic consequences of eros for glory unbounded in a figure like Achilles, while in Thucydides we have something very similar, but this time at the level of politics, and that longing, that political eros, exposes an entire people to tragedy. And this also serves as a great point where we can emphasize what it is that is so fundamentally important about eros and pleonexia for the Greeks versus our situation in our own time. And what I mean by that is in all of the Greeks, whether you're talking about Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, all of them are fundamentally concerned with education, and in particular, the education of man's eros, because in every single case, it is simply understood that man, by nature, has this dangerous element of pleonexia within his soul, always grasping for more. And so the whole purpose of education is not to eradicate that kind of pleonexia. That would be impossible. Rather, is to educate that eros in the soul of man so that the pleonexia, the always grasping for more, is directed towards noble things. In other words, towards the beautiful. That's what we in our time, in our education, have lost. And so you see why it is that reading people like Homer or Plato, and here, especially with Thucydides, such deliberate and focused reading, studying is so crucial, because it's not simply the fate of one man with unbounded desire for glory on the line. No, in fact, it's an entire people that's at stake. And that is what gets us to the core of what Thucydides has found that's so universal about the particular of the Peloponnesian War. And so you see all of these things coming together, namely the irreducible element of chance and motions for man in political community, along with how it is that in these periods of brief rest where man's power of mind has the opportunity to show itself, most especially by way of techne, to accomplish greatness amid the ceaseless flux. But with this opportunity to accomplish greatness, there is also the ever-present danger of misdirected eros. And remember, our theme here in this entire series is the role of technology and nihilism. And the misdirection of eros at its very height of mind in the form of techne is going to be where we find in Thucydides the role of the divine. And with all of that on the table now, we turn back to the archaeology and begin our way into paragraph 4.